Right, good morning Year 13. I'm your substitute teacher for today because unfortunately Mr. Innes can't be with us. Today I decided Sam wanted to do some Unit 2, and because Copenhagen's in the news at the moment, we're going to be looking at negative externalities, climate change, and ways that the government can intervene to make it the social optimum for the public. Just to give a bit of background on what's happening in Copenhagen, we did have a big climate conference about 10 years ago in Kyoto in Japan. And what happened is the EU decided they're going to raise carbon dioxide by 8%, the rest of the world by 6%, and George Bush decided he wouldn't really turn up or adhere to it at all, which meant the whole thing really broke down, given that they are one of the biggest carbon dioxide producers in the world. So in Copenhagen at the moment, there are a few theories you're going to have to know about, which they're going to try and apply to try and combat climate change. The first one is this one. Let's see how do I do this. Right, this one here. Right, how it works is they say they're going to tax pollution. So for every cubic meter of carbon dioxide you produce, they're going to make you pay a tax. So it starts off with you producing there with SO and the demand. Then what happens is the government says for every amount you supply, we're going to increase the price by that arrow there, that tax. So that shifts your cost. So at each quantity, your cost becomes that much more, shifts the supply curve upwards by that amount. So the equilibrium moves from there up to there. The government then collects the shaded area in tax because his tax is the length of the arrow, and we multiply it by the quantity. Same as when you figure out the area of a rectangle, just quantity, multiplied by the tax, the government collects that amount and can spend it on other things that might be related to climate change. Unfortunately for the companies, they're going to lose out, and because there's a lot of political pressure from the companies, and this is something you should mention, because it's a relevant economic factor, they're going to put pressure on the governments not to do this. And this is because at the beginning, they are paying this price and they're willing to pay up to the demand there. That's what they were willing to pay at any given quantity, which means the difference between what they're willing to pay, this line here, willing to pay this line here, and what they do pay is kind of like the goodness which they take home and put in their pockets. They're willing to pay that, they only have to pay that, they pocket the difference in terms of utility. Unfortunately for them, when the tax raises, they only do this smaller, they only get this smaller triangle. So they're not happy because they only get that smaller triangle of utility, which is a measure of economic goodness, not necessarily money. And before, they were getting the slightly bigger triangle that I've got up there. That's something you should definitely try and mention. If you remember this diagram, you do pretty well. Now you get a lot of points for evaluating. So anything you can say about this is going to be good. One thing you could say is that it's very hard for the government to decide what the right level of tax is for society, because the government's got no idea what the socially optimal amount of climate change is, and it's pretty much impossible for them to figure it out. Right, so you can say that whatever the tax is, it's pretty much bound to be wrong, and there's about as much chance as that being right as their set level of output being right, because they've got no idea, and that's something that you can put as an evaluative thing, which gets you loads of marks. Another theory that I've dug up, which gets you lots of evaluation marks, is this. This was, so the Coase theorem. This was set up by a guy from Chicago, which is a university that's famed for its free market economics. He says, this guy says, if the property rights, so that's the ownership of absolutely everything, is fully assigned, so if everyone owns everything, then people can negotiate, it has to be at low cost, to find an efficient solution. So for example, if you own your house and your neighbour owns their house, and you say have a party and create the negative externality of noise pollution, you should be able to negotiate with him to come up with a solution. So every time he throws a party, he has to pay you 100 quid to make up for the fact that you're not going to get to sleep until not get to sleep until about 3 in the morning when he finally turns his music off. What you could evaluate this with, because it's a relevant theorem, but it doesn't really apply to climate change, is that no one really owns the climate. So if you can explain it, give an example, but say, unfortunately, property rights aren't fully assigned in terms of the climate because no one really owns the clouds. You get a nice point for critiquing a theory. This is something that would happen without government intervention, and pretty much the only way that it can happen with government intervention. So if you can prove this theory wrong, you could present an argument that government intervention is needed in climate change once you've accepted that climate change does present negative consequences for other people. So once you've accepted that carbon dioxide does produce bad things like flooding, then you can run with this theory. Another thing, and the thing that the US likes, the US, who are finally actually turning up to this event, quite like their free market ideas, and this has a market to it. What this is a diagram for trade pollution permits. So without any government intervention, you've got supply of pollution. And so your demand for companies to produce pollution, your supply of it, so let's say the coal that or the oil that they burn in their big plant somewhere, there's always going to be input cost to producing the pollution. They'll produce this much at this price. What you do is you say, no one's allowed to produce more than these. We're going to produce permits, and you can buy these permits. So instantly, the quantity is reduced to here. Then these permits are traded at a certain price, which will be incremental to the company's cost, and they'll have to pay that additionally. So what ends up happening is the producer is now buying that much at that price. It was buying, so the people who are making the pollution, demanding pollution, pay that much at that price instead of that much at that price. They've lost this amount of utility. And the idea is if that loss is more than what it would cost to implement some green stuff, like converting to renewable energy, then they'll be incentivized to actually go ahead and do that. So the idea is if the cost, and the same works for the producer loss in taxes, the idea is if that cost is quite a lot, they're going to have an incentive, if it's cheaper to buy the wind plant, whatever it is, to switch to that. Which brings us on to the other thing that the US is doing a lot of, because last year, you might remember, and there's something going the way around, you should notice, you should read about, is that the US went and spent loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of money on promoting promoting green projects, because they had to spend lots of money to stimulate their economy, something you can link back to other modules, like Module 4, I think. And they decided to spend a lot of that on subsidizing lots of green stuff. So here we've got your supply and demand, same thing again, but kind of in reverse to the tax. In the beginning, they were operating at this supply. So it meets demand there, that's your equilibrium. They produce that many wind farms or whatever it is at that price. What you then do is you subsidize the supply. So for everyone who produces a wind plant, you give them that much, so their price can drop that much. This shifts the supply curve down like that. Got a new equilibrium there, so now we're producing more, move from there to there, more wind farms or filters on your factory to take out the carbon dioxide or whatever it is. It does mean though that the government has to pay the quantity, which is here, multiplied by the subsidy, which is right up there. So if they had to pay 100 quid, they have subsidised every wind turbine by £1 million, and they sold 500, and then 500 wind farms are built, they'd have to pay 500 million, this big rectangle, in subsidy. And what you could argue, and the different sides I'm going to leave you up to research, is whether that 500 million is worth reducing the carbon dioxide. Because yeah, it'll produce a bit of flooding maybe, but is it worth 500 million? That's pretty much all the theories you need to know. What I'm going to do is send Miss Snow some links on Copenhagen, I'm going to give you some questions as well. You can replay this again and again and again. It's quite difficult because you can't ask questions. And what I want to see is some answers which include these diagrams. If you get the diagrams in your essays, you make loads of points. Also, any sentences that end or that start even with "on the other hand" or something like that are going to be great, because in the extended questions, about a third of the marks are for evaluating, so for saying the pros and cons towards your thing and towards your argument. Make sure you define everything at the beginning of your questions, and then of course evaluate your points after you make them. That's all the actual teaching bit. You can watch this again and again and again and again. You can rewind for the diagrams. The questions and article I want you to write about will be with Miss Snow. Right, that's it.